talking about Old Wolves is that you are off point. Thank you very much. It's only 1:28 and we seem to be all here, so thank you very much. We have Christopher Schenk today. I think many of you will remember him. He was one of our graduate students from 1972 to 75. Worked with Robin Gandy, I think, who a lot of people will remember. And his uncle, well, we will find out about all this, Professor Hans Schenk, was a governing body fellow here. I remember him very well, immaculately dressed. He always kissed my hand when he saw me. I don't know anything about Willy, but I suppose we will today, and so we look forward to that. I just want to point out that this is being videoed strictly on Chris because Mrs. Schenk isn't able to be here, and so it's purely for personal interest. If anybody is worried about being in this, I have to say this, move away, but it doesn't look like it. And we might keep a copy in the archives purely for personal research purposes. That's it. So, without more ado, we're very glad to have you here.
Thank you very much, Alan. As you say, several people in the audience today will remember my Uncle Hans. But nobody, not even me, will remember my father Willy, because he died on June the 18th, 1949, almost 70 years ago, 2 months before I was born. So you can imagine my surprise when I returned from holiday last year to find a large package from my German friend Regula Loza that contained an eyewitness account of Willy just after the war, when he was in the British Army of Occupation stationed in Hamburg. Regula's cousin Dorothea had transcribed an interview her mother Anna had given in 1995 about her memories of life in Hamburg during and immediately after the war. Anna gives a vivid account of the British Army soldier who arrived unexpectedly at their house and made friends with her father, Wilhelm Flittner, a leading anti-Nazi academic, and the whole family. Now, as well as this account, I have also got a number of other documents to draw upon. When my mother, Wenna, died in 1988, we found a lot of papers relating to Willy in her house, including letters between Wenna and Willy and letters from Willy's mother, Ilse, to Wenna, that my wife, Sarah, transcribed using the cutting-edge technology of the time, a BBC computer. When my Aunt Hazel, who many of you will remember, died in 2008, we found a large number of documents relating to Hans, as well as many relating to Willy. Hans and Hazel had very different attitudes to filing. Hans had several multi-drawer filing cabinets, all labelled neatly in his handwriting, in which he placed apposite quotations for use in his forthcoming, though never to be written, book about the decline of religion in the West. Hazel never threw anything away, but her approach to filing was haphazard. So, following her death, we would open, for example, a drawer labelled by Hans as Nietzsche and the Apotheosis of Irreligion to find last year's gas bills. We're still in the process of organising the rich but muddled archive she bequeathed. Talking of archives, I feel enormously privileged to live near Oxford, the city of archives and archivists. In preparing this talk, I contacted archivists in London and Manchester, but mainly in Oxford, and received great help from all of them. In particular, I discovered that the archives of the Society for the Protection of Science and Learning are held in a special collection in the Bodleian Library. In that collection, there is a thick file relating to Hans that gave me all sorts of information and insights into the struggles he had during the war years. Like many people here today, when I have to give my name, I'm nearly always asked, how do you spell it? When I've spelt it, there's often a follow-up question. That's an unusual surname. Where does it come from? To which I reply that my father was a refugee from Prague. Ah, they frequently say knowingly, so he was Czech. At this point, I usually grunt non-committally. But I really ought to say, no, not exactly. Both Hans and Willy had Czechoslovakian nationality, and that was to prove very important to them in wartime Britain. But they were not Czechs, nor were they Slovaks. This photograph of Hans, aged 10, and Willy, aged 4, with their mother Ilsa and their nanny Lissy, reveals their true ethnicity. Both of them were born as subjects of the Austro-Hungarian monarch. Hans on the 6th of April 1912, when the Emperor Franz Joseph was in the 64th year of his reign, and Willy on the 26th of July 1918, during the short reign of the Emperor Charles, the last monarch of Austria-Hungary. Actually, this photograph is a bit misleading. They didn't walk around Prague dressed in Austrian traditional costume. That would have been a bit provocative in the early days of the Czechoslovak Republic. But they were part of the German-speaking minority in Prague. It was a substantial minority. Around a third of the population of the Czech lands between the wars were German speakers, and Prague was a bilingual city, like Brussels today, with parallel Czech and German institutions, including universities. The photograph, however, was taken in 1922 during their summer holidays at their lakeside house in Unterach am Attersee in Austria. We have a photo of the house taken from the lake. So when my daughter Tabitha and I visited Prague in 2009, we hired a car and drove down to Attersee, where we took a boat down the lake to Unterach. We had the old photo with us, and as we looked at the houses on the lakeside, we kept saying, could be that one. Then we saw it and knew it must be that one. We got off the boat and walked up the road to the house. When we rang the bell, an elderly woman in a bathing costume came to the door. I explained who we were, in my halting German, and why we had come, and immediately she said, "Ah, yes, of course. My mother bought the house from Frau Schenk of Prague in 1938. It's obvious from what I've said already that the Schenks were comfortably off, able to afford a live-in nanny and a holiday home. Ferdinand, Hans and Willy's father, was a professor of gynecology and obstetrics in the medical faculty of the German University in Prague. He was born into a Jewish family in a small town 50 miles to the west of Prague, but became a Roman Catholic in order to marry Ilsa in Vienna in 1911, since there was no such thing as civil marriage in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. I think this photo of Ilsa was taken around the time of her wedding. She'd had a difficult childhood. Her mother, who was from an aristocratic Bohemian family called Weber von Ebenhof, died at the age of 25 when Ilsa was only 2. She was mainly brought up by her paternal grandparents, who were Transylvanian Saxons, part of the substantial German-speaking community in Transylvania, which was then part of Hungary but is now in Romania. She also spent some time with her unhappy father, who never got over his wife's early death. He was also a doctor and worked in Venice, then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. She was a good linguist and spoke fluent Italian, and somewhere along the way learnt English as well as French. She worked as a translator before and during the Second World War. Now, a word about names. On the title page of Hans's 2 books, his name is given as HG, which of course stands for Hans Georg. But as many of you know, that isn't the whole story. He had 4 given names: Hans, Georg, Arthur, Victor. But of course, Hans is just short for Johann, which is also frequently shortened to Jan, which could be either German or Czech. And his baptismal certificate gives his full name as Johann Bapt Georg Arthur Victor. So HG or JGAV, Hans or Jan, either or both. On Willy's 2 books, his name is given more simply as W. Schenk, which stands for Wilhelm Schenk. And of course, in pre-war Prague, he was known as Willy. But when he came to Britain, he often anglicised the pronunciation to Willy. And since he was keen from the start to assimilate, I'm calling him Willy throughout. Like Hans, he actually had 4 names: Wilhelm Friedrich Alfred Maximilian Schenk. Just to add one more complication, his birth certificate is bilingual in German and Czech, and his first name is also given in its Czech version, Willem. During the war, he often used the Czech version, so W or WFAM or V, all 3. He left secondary school, the German gymnasium, in the summer of 1936 and enrolled at the German University of Prague the following autumn, first in the law faculty, afterwards transferring to philosophy. His school leaving certificate shows that he studied 4 languages: German, Czech, Latin and ancient Greek, and that he was given the highest mark, sehr gut, in the admirably simple and enduring German assessment system. He had also learnt French and some Italian, but the foreign language he knew best was English, and he had an English pen friend, Donald Barron, who had come to stay with the family in Prague in 1938. In the autumn of that year, Willy did not return to the German university, which had become increasingly dominated by students who supported the Nazis. Instead, in January 1939, while he was still in Prague, he registered as an external student at the University of London under his Czech name, Willem. Hans, being that much older, had done more in his education and in his career in pre-war Prague. He'd made a name for himself as a strong chess player. In the 70s, he wrote an article for Lycidas, which was then the Wolfson College magazine, called Chess Reminiscences. He recalls that in 1929, when he was 17, he was one of 30 players taken on in Prague by Nimzovich in a simultaneous exhibition. I happened to be the last player left after the other 29 games had been finished, he writes. So Nimzovich sat down to play the end game against me. Although I had a slight disadvantage, I managed to hang on for a draw, after which I was immediately enlisted to join the Prager Schach Club, which recruited its members from the German-speaking minority in the Bohemian capital. He went on to even greater things in the 30s when he defeated Capablanca in another simultaneous exhibition. Hans studied law at the German University and also at the Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich and the Academy of International Law in The Hague. He was in Munich for the winter semester of 1932 to 33. So when Hitler first came to power as Chancellor on 30th of January 1933, Hans was in Bavaria, the heartland of National Socialism. In 1935, he was awarded a doctorate in law and was appointed as an assistant at the Institute of Political Science. He worked closely with Professor Hans Kelsen, an eminent legal and political philosopher who was an outspoken critic of the Nazis. During Kelsen's short time as Professor of International Law at the German University of Prague from October 1936 to February 1938, he had many difficulties with Nazi-supporting students. In a testimonial written in 1947, when Kelsen was Professor of Political Science at Berkeley, he says of Hans, "In my conflict with the Nazi students in Prague, he firmly and courageously stood on my side in spite of all disadvantages he had to endure as a consequence of his attitude." The first disadvantage that he had to endure was that his university post was not renewed at the end of 1937. So in January 1938, he started working for the Czechoslovak Civil Service as an official in the Ministry of Social Welfare. In September 1938, Sudetenland, the area near the border where German speakers were in a majority, was ceded to Germany, endorsed by the Munich Agreement. Hans's job at the ministry involved welfare for anti-Nazi refugees from Sudetenland, amid an atmosphere of growing support for the Nazis among the German-speaking community in Prague. On the 9th of January 1939, he was given notice of dismissal from the ministry to take effect in March. No reason was given, but it was undoubtedly because of his political views and his active support for the anti-Nazi Social Democratic Party, expressed, for example, through an article he published in 1938 called Aufbau und Schutz der Demokratie, Building and Protecting Democracy. So, from January 1939, Hans and Willy accelerated their plans to leave for Britain in March. Hans wrote to the Society for the Protection of Science and Learning in London. This was an organisation that had been founded in 1933 with the express purpose of giving support to academics who'd been forced to leave Germany, and later Austria and Czechoslovakia, by the Nazis. SPSL sent a letter to Hans, which he hoped would help him to be allowed to enter Britain. Willy wrote to his English pen friend, Donald, who enlisted the help of his father, Berkeley Baron, a liberal-minded social reformer who played a prominent part in TOC H. Their Czechoslovak passports, notice that Hans's is signed Dr. Jan Schenk, did not contain visas for Britain, but they hoped to gain admission nonetheless. Hans, through his letter from SPSL and an invitation to the International Chess Congress in Hastings. Willy, through his registration with London University and his contacts with the Baron family. They planned to leave by an early train on Wednesday, the 15th of March. On the day before, Slovakia declared its independence. The president of Czechoslovakia, Edvard Beneš, had resigned and gone into exile shortly before the annexation of Sudetenland 6 months earlier. His successor, Emil Hacker, was in a very weak position with regard to Germany, since the annexation of Sudetenland stripped Czechoslovakia of its natural and military defences. Hacker requested a meeting with Hitler following the secession of Slovakia, and during a long night of heated exchanges, Hitler was able to browbeat him into agreeing a German takeover of the Czech lands as the German protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. The agreement was signed at 4 o'clock in the morning of the 15th of March, and by 6 o'clock, German troops began pouring over the border and took possession of the country, while the Czech military was commanded to step down and allow them to enter. Hans and Willy were on the train that left Prague at about 7 o'clock. So this short video clip if I can get it to work. And I can't get the mouse to work, so... Oh, there we are, that's it, yeah. Will show you the sort of things that they would have been able to see if they looked out of the window. It's often said that the German army were able to walk into Prague. It's interesting to note from the video that some of them cycled. Hans and Willy reached the border with Germany much more quickly than you would today, because of course the border had moved with the annexation of Sudetenland. This stamp in his passport shows that the border crossing certificate was issued in Lobositz, a small town on the left bank of the river Elbe, now known by its Czech name of Lovosice, some 40 miles northwest of Prague, and these days at least another 40 miles away from the border. While they were travelling across Germany, two things happened which they only found out about later. In a speech made in Prague Castle, Hitler announced that all German speakers in Bohemia and Moravia were now full citizens of Germany. It's just as well they didn't know that, because they were much better off as Czechoslovak citizens in wartime Britain. The second thing was that Sir John Simon, who was then the Chancellor of the Exchequer, announced late at night in the House of Commons that refugees from Czechoslovakia were to be given preferential treatment when applying for entry into Britain. On the 16th of March, they reached the Dutch border at Oldenzaal. On the German side of the border, they were asked by German officials whether they were Jews. They could honestly answer no, even though their father was Jewish, because by Jewish halakha, Jewishness can only be transmitted matrilineally. Sorry, can't say that. They caught the night ferry from Hook of Holland and landed in Harwich early the following morning. They were allowed into the UK for a maximum of 3 months initially, on the strict condition that they would not work. Barclay Barron was there to meet them and wrote about the occasion as follows. They landed in England on the 17th of March 1939 with no visible means of support whatever. I met them on arrival, arranged hospitality and provided them from my personal funds with immediate necessities. I had already signed a guarantee to the Home Office that I would be responsible for their support, so that no charges in the event of their sickness or unemployment would fall on the British public funds. Within days of arriving in England, they went to the Czechoslovak embassy in London to extend the validity of their passports to enable them to travel to the United States of America. The status of the embassy was anomalous, to say the least. Czechoslovakia ceased to exist on the 15th of March 1939. Although Beneš had set up a Czechoslovak National Liberation Committee, it was not recognised by the British government as the Czechoslovakian government in exile until 1940. Nevertheless, as you can see from the stamp in Hans's passport, the embassy extended its validity on the 21st of March 1939. There were good reasons for Hans and Willy to want to go to America. They weren't the first Schenks to emigrate from Prague. In 1893, Ferdinand's younger brother Karl had gone to New York at the age of 19, same age that Willy was then. This photograph was taken shortly before he left Prague. Uncle Karl had prospered in America. he'd become a banker, and by 1939 he was vice president of the Trade Bank and Trust Company. It was very difficult to transfer money between countries, but he did manage to give his nephews some modest financial help during the war. Much later, in the 50s, Hans wrote to his cousin Henry, who was also a banker, explaining that his main preoccupation was writing books and that didn't pay very well. Henry replied with the suggestion that Hans should write a bestseller. For some reason, Hans never acted on this advice. Hans was also advised that it would be much easier for him to get an academic job in the States than in Britain in his field of international law and political science. Emigration to America remained his aim until at least 1943. His plan was to get a job there and then to bring his parents over from Prague to join him. In the interim, it wasn't at all clear what he should be doing in England. Berkeley Baron was comfortably off and well connected, but by no means rich. He arranged for Hans to be given hospitality for short periods by a succession of his friends and acquaintances. As Hans wrote to the SPSL in April 1940, "I've managed to find some hospitality between March and Christmas 1939, but altogether I had to move more than 20 times from place to place." That works out as moving about once a fortnight. "When one has nothing to do," Hans goes on, "this may be quite entertaining, but you will certainly appreciate that it is absolutely impossible to do serious research work in such circumstances." Willy was more fortunate. For a start, he knew what he was going to do and rapidly got on with his history degree as an external student of London University. Secondly, he had somewhere stable to live for the 2 months of the Oxford Trinity term. I discovered a dozen letters still in their envelopes from Willy's parents, addressed to him at Pusey House between April and June. I emailed Pusey House to try to find out more and had a very helpful reply from Anna James, the librarian and archivist. She found an entry in the diary of Canon Freddie Hood, the principal at the time, saying, "Our Sudeten German refugee from Prague, Willy Schenk, arrived about S." That's to say, Sunday the 16th of April, the beginning of North Week. With the help of documents that Anna found for me, I eventually uncovered an earlier entry in Canon Hood's diary that showed why Willy was invited into residence at Pusey House. On the 17th of January, when Willy was still in Prague, his pen friend Donald Barron, who was then a second-year undergraduate at Teddy Hall reading modern languages, came to dinner in Pusey House and told the principal about Willy, prompting him to note in his diary, "We may give him hospitality later on." By the time the war broke out on the 3rd of September, Willy and Hans were back together and made strenuous efforts to contact their parents, with a view to finding a way to get them out. Surprisingly, despite the war, a letter dated 14th of September got through to them from Ferdinand. It was written in English, perhaps to make it easier to get past the British censor, or perhaps to make it more difficult for the German censor to understand it. Ferdinand says, "My dearest children, we got your messages from September the 3rd, 4th, 5th and 6th, and we are very happy to hear that you are both well and live together. Everything you wrote us about our case, we will earnestly consider it." Pretty good English, but not perfect. "We had to take a new flat of 2 rooms and kitchen. It is a very nice flat with modern comfort. From October the 1st, we will give up the telephone." For all Ferdinand's upbeat manner, it was clearly a step down in the world. Their spacious apartment in the centre of town had been commandeered by the Germans, and their small new flat in the suburbs was rented in Lissy's name so that it would not be taken away from them because of Ferdinand's Jewish origins. In late December 1939, Hans finally made it to the Hastings Chess Congress. It was a mere shadow of its former self, with only 8 players, 7 of whom were British. So Hans single-handedly made it into an international congress. 1940 was a better year for Hans. He decided to take another doctorate, this time a D.Phil at Oxford. In a sense, this was a backward step for him, but one of his reasons for doing so was to improve his chances of getting an academic job in the States, which was still his goal. He contacted the Postgraduate Aid Committee, chaired by the Master of Balliol, and renewed his requests for help from the SPSL. This letter from Ronald Bell, the fellow and tutor in chemistry at Balliol, who was secretary of the Postgraduate Aid Committee, to Miss Simpson, the secretary of SPSL, makes it clear why Hans's case was particularly difficult. Though young, he writes about Hans, he is considerably more experienced than most of the people with whom we have had to deal, and it seems to me that he rather lies in the no man's land between the SPSL and this committee. At this end, I have managed to persuade Exeter College to admit him with remission of all fees, and this would also exempt him from any university dues. Thus he would be able to take an advanced degree and enjoy some of the amenities of the university life without any cost. On the other hand, we're not able to make any direct financial grant to him for maintenance, and I understand that his guarantors are not at all well off and are keeping his younger brother, who is an external student of London University. I wonder, therefore, whether there is a chance that the SPSL might be able to make him a small grant for maintenance. Judging from other people here in similar position, it could be at considerably less than your usual rates, e.g. I estimate that £50 would keep him for about 6 months. Hans's own letters to Miss Simpson give an interesting insight into his precarious financial situation. In April 1940, he writes that he has found a room with full board and everything included for 27 shillings a week. Eventually, the SPSL agreed to fund him at a rate of £100 a year, but only for 3 months at a time, pending a further application. So his money worries continued. He matriculated as a graduate student at Exeter College on the 4th of May 1940, and soon afterwards he received his first monthly payment from SPSL of £8, 6 and 8 His supervisor was G.D.H. Cole, then at Univ. Hans first proposed a broad subject for his thesis, building on his work in international law and political science, a comparison of attempts at international cooperation from the Concert of Europe up to and including the League of Nations. In the manner of D.Phil supervisors, Cole urged Hans to focus more narrowly, suggesting the earlier period. As a result, Hans's transition from international lawyer to historian came about more by chance than by conscious choice. I'm not sure when the prohibition against employment was lifted, but soon after Willy graduated with a first-class degree, he got a teaching job at Collier's School in Horsham in September 1941. You can see from this testimonial that the headmaster was pleasantly surprised that a foreigner could do the job. He had to face a very difficult task, he writes. I expected Mr. Schenk, as a foreigner and an inexperienced schoolmaster, to find all such things great impediments. But his obvious ability, enthusiasm, and gifts of personality appeared to sweep aside all difficulties. The head is not quite right in saying that he left in July 1942 on his appointment as a history lecturer in Manchester University. In fact, Willy went to Manchester as a lector in the German department. His predecessor in the post held German citizenship and was interned as an enemy alien. Willy, a citizen of Czechoslovakia, was classified as a friendly alien and was able to cover the post on a temporary basis. The problem was that he had to leave Collier's before the end of the school term. Hans stepped in, took over from Willy for the last few weeks of term. The appointment at Manchester was a fantastic opportunity for Willy. As well as teaching in the German department, he enrolled for a PhD in history with E.F. Jacob as his supervisor. His doctoral thesis was later published as his first book, The Concern for Social Justice in the Puritan Revolution. Among his fellow students were a group of progressively minded Catholics that included Robert Marcus, Walter Stein, and John McCabe, who became Father Herbert McCabe and was at Blackfriars in Oxford for many years. Among staff, he got to know Lionel Knights, then a lecturer in English, later to be professor in Cambridge. Hans had also begun to earn some money. His name is in the lecture list for Hilary Term 1942, lecturing twice a week in Exeter College on European economic history, 1815 to 1848. Hans and Willy had spent Easter together in 1942. They could still communicate with their parents in Prague, but it was an arduous and slow process. They were allowed only 25 words on a Red Cross form that was sent to Geneva and then to Prague. On the 27th of March, they wrote, "Dearest parents and Lissy, we are spending our Easter holidays together. Hans is preparing lectures. Willy is writing his dissertation. We are well. Write soon. Kisses, Hans and Willy." Well, they couldn't write soon because it was more than 3 months later, on the 7th of July, that they were given the opportunity to write a reply. On the back of the form, it was also limited to 25 words. Goodness knows when they received it. This is what it says. "Are healthy. Lissy underwent fracture surgery last month, which has gone well. Is completely painless and healthy. Write soon. Most intimate kisses. Lissy, parents." It was a bit like sending telegrams, but telegrams that take 6 months to get there and back. In Michaelmas 1942, Hans began to give tutorials to students in LMH and St Hilda's. Joyce Marjorie Hazel, with 2 L's, generally known as Hazel with 1 L, was not one of his students because she was reading classics at St Hilda's, but they met and were married on the 12th of April 1944. From the index of marriages, it looks as if Hazel was a bigamist because there are 2 entries, in one of which she marries Hans Schenk, and in the other she marries Jan Schenk. With Hans's obsessive interest in dates, he calculated that his wife was exactly 7 years, 1 month, and 3 days younger than him. Remember those figures. Meanwhile, Willy frequently had to travel by train from Manchester to Aberystwyth to visit the National Library of Wales, where many of the books he needed for his doctoral research were stored during the war. On one of these journeys, he met a Welsh primary school teacher who was working in Manchester, Morwenna Jones Burton, known as Wenna, who was on her way to see her family near Machynlleth. They married a few weeks after Hans and Hazel in May 1944. In the sexist manner of the times, married women took on the nationality and status of their husband. So overnight, Hazel and Wenna became friendly aliens. After doing primary training in May and June, Willy joined the British Army on the 28th of June 1944. In July, he gave Wenner a copy of Edward Lear's nonsense songs with words inspired by the Jumblies written on the flyleaf to denote their precarious financial situation. We are going to sea in a sieve, we are going to sea in a sieve. As an alien, even a friendly one, he had to join the Pioneer Corps as a private soldier, even though digging holes and trenches were not among his many talents. On deployment with his unit, he carried his PhD thesis in his knapsack and worked on it in the evenings, predictably earning the nickname Prof. Only after the end of the war were his talents used more effectively, when he was transferred to the Education Corps with the rank of sergeant, and he was also used as an interpreter, on one occasion accompanying an officer to the recently liberated Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. Just 9 days after victory in Europe was declared, on the 17th of May 1945, Ferdinand died in Prague of natural causes at the age of 75. It was characteristic of the times that his death announcement was made not in German, nor bilingually, but only in Czech. For understandable reasons, the end of the war brought with it a wave of animosity towards the German-speaking minority. Ferdinand had been persecuted by the Nazis during the war for being Jewish. Had he lived, he would have been discriminated against after the war for being a German speaker. In many ways, the remarkable thing was that he survived the war, since so many of his friends and family had been taken away, first to Theresienstadt and then to Auschwitz. With Willy away in the army, it fell to Hans to try and find a way for Ilse and Lissy to join them in England. To the credit of Ilse and Hans, neither of them would contemplate leaving Lissy behind. She'd worked for the family for decades, always on the understanding that she'd be looked after in her old age. In 1945, Hans's financial circumstances improved when he was awarded a senior research fellow by the National Institute of Economic and Social Research. The subject of his research was European Romanticism and the Social Revolution, 1790 to 1830. It was certainly a revelation to me that he began working on Romanticism at such an early stage. It was quite a long time before his book on it came to fruition. His salary was £450 a year. Considering he'd been living on a grant of £100 a year, that was an amazing step up. And that would enable him to find a home that he and Hazel could share with Ilse and Lissy. After much lobbying, they were both given visas and flew from Prague to Croydon Aerodrome on the 18th of April, 1946. The date provided Hans with his own personal proof of the existence of God. The time between his emigration and that of his mother was 7 years, 1 month, and 3 days, exactly the same as the interval between his birth date and that of Hazel. To Hans's logical chess-playing mind, this was conclusive evidence of the work of an all-powerful deity. It was simply inconceivable that such symmetry could be the product of mere coincidence. Despite the war, and despite their financial and other difficulties, the 1940s were a very productive time academically for the two brothers. They both completed doctoral theses which were published as books. In addition, Hans published a couple of articles in the Cambridge Journal on his new research interest of European Romanticism. Willy published no less than 12 articles of astonishing breadth and variety in Scrutiny, Humanitas, the Church Quarterly Review, and other journals. Most were historical, including 2 about Cardinal Pole, the subject of his second book. But there were also articles about music and about German and English literature, in one of which he revealed that he had made a translation of T.S. Eliot's 4 quartets into German. No mean task. He also published an article in the Manchester Guardian called The Other Germany. He had to publish it anonymously because it gave an account of his contacts with German families like the Flittners, which was against King's regulations forbidding fraternisation. So I end as I began, with Anna Henning's Memories of Willy in the British Army in Hamburg. Willy Schenk stood one day as an English soldier in uniform outside our front door. We were always afraid that our house, like so many houses in our district, would be confiscated. So I was quite frightened when I saw the Englishman standing in front of our door. He bowed politely, laughing cheerfully, and asked whether he could speak to the professor. I let him in and led him into my father's study, where the whole family at once gathered around him. He had already reassured us that he had been looking for us not on official business, but from a private interest. He immediately engaged my father in a conversation about literary and historical matters. It soon became apparent that he, still young in years, was employed at the University of Manchester after emigrating in 1939 from Prague to England. And now he had come to Hamburg as an agent of the occupying power. He had asked in the Rauenhaus bookshop, which was a well-known meeting place for members of the German resistance, whether there was an intellectual who was not a Nazi. He was told about Professor Flittner. And so he came to us. He was an attractive, lovable man with so much character and cheerfulness that he drew us all into his spell. Willy Schenk found our father to be an interesting and lively man, and discussions with him were so stimulating that he forgot time. He was supposed to be back in the barracks by 10 o'clock. Since it was too late, we invited him to sleep in the library on the divan. However, he was so fascinated by my father's library and so starved of German literature and ideas that he spent the whole night reading instead of going to sleep. He visited us often, even after he had been transferred to Göttingen, and every time he came to us, it was a festival. He had a British wife, and she sent us food packages. Willy Schenk, the highly talented, versatile man, was also musical. He played the piano, and I often played with him. In addition, he was also a splendid singer with a tenor voice, very popular in choirs. We were not allowed to be seen publicly on the streets with Willy Schenk, the English soldier, because of the prohibition of fraternisation. He was introduced to our extended circle of friends. It was customary in our house that occasional lectures were held, to which numerous guests were invited. Even during the war, my father had given various lectures to guests. After the war, this tradition was continued, and so Willy Schenk gave us a few lectures, for example, on the spiritual and religious situation in contemporary England, or on the spiritual foundations of democracy. He especially endeavoured to introduce us to the Four Quartets by T.S. Eliot. At the end of 1946, he was released from military service and returned to England. In 1947, he became a lecturer at the University of Exeter. And there I shall leave Willy in 73 Poleslow Road with Wenna and their baby daughter Eleanor, while Hans is living in Oxford in a flat in a large house in Park Town, rented from Miss Merivale, with Hazel, Ilse and Lissy, who brought her recipe book with her from Prague and cooks delicious meals for the family, using ingredients that she buys in Palm's Delicatessen in the covered market. Hans was appointed as a university lecturer in 1947, but he had to wait for many years until the founding of Iffley College, the precursor of Wolfson, before he gained a college fellowship.
Charming and affectionate talk about your uncle and your father. I found it very, very interesting. I do remember Auntie Hazel very, very well. She used to come into the lot at Wolfson. And what an amazingly clever use of family archives. Very, very good and very well put together, I thought. The thought of the gas bills in a actually makes people working in archives feel quite sick, but I know the problem, yeah. Would you take any questions?
Absolutely, yes.
Anyone have any questions? Stuart?
Thank you for that. That was actually memorable. I was wondering whether you could tell us something about the reaction towards the two brothers on the part of the local ordinary English people that they encountered. For example, in Oxford, I remember Hans telling me on one occasion that he was in lodging somewhere in Oxford, and during the night, of course, blackout was compulsory. And at one point, the landlady walked in, and there was a slight gap between the curtains, and she exploded, "I always knew you were a German spy!" So, did that translate into other contexts?
Well, I think that was the exception rather than the rule. For the most part, they found a great welcome among the liberal-minded people who they were passed on one from another to stay for a fortnight or so. Friends of Berkeley Baron. I mean, of course, it's important to remember that when they came over in 1939, it was by no means clear that the whole of the country was in favour of Czechoslovakia, and after all, Chamberlain was still in power. Halifax was an important influence on the government. But the circles in which they moved, largely because they were friends of their guarantor, were in the more liberal elements. And they found, for the most part, a great welcome. And of course, even among landladies in Oxford, they had various different experiences. They did stay. Hans stayed in many different places, but among them was Beaumont Cottage, 1 Beaumont Buildings. And there's this photograph taken in 1971, which Hubert was kind enough to send me, in which you can see Hans and Hazel with their adopted son Graham, and rather young-looking versions of Hubert Zawadzki, Roger Househair, Stephen Grounds, and me. That's right. And Stephen, yes, I said Stephen Grounds, yes. Yes, Roger, I said, yes. The guest of honour in the middle there, the diminutive guest of honour, is Miss Simmons, the landlady of Beaumont Cottage for many decades. Her father was a scout at St John's, and she lived there as a child. One of her earliest memories was of when she was sent into the centre of Oxford on an errand and was delayed on the way home because there was a bonfire lit at the end of George Street to celebrate the relief of Mafeking.
We must get a copy of this in the college archives. We have? Right.
I think I have the legacy.
Any other questions? Liz?
When they crossed over Europe, Hans and Willy, and they got as far as the Dutch border, and they were asked if they were Jewish,
Yes.
they were able to reply that they were not. What would have happened if they'd said, actually, we are Jewish, and were they aware of the import of the question?
I think they were very aware of the import of the question. Had they been Jewish, I think it's highly unlikely that they would have said, yes, we are. But who knows what would have happened if they had been strongly suspected of being Jewish at that point. It was before the war, of course, and Holland was independent and hadn't, it was before the Nazi invasion of Holland. But even so, that crossing into Holland was a crucial one. It is interesting that they travelled right across Germany. Judith Kerr's father, who also escaped from Prague, actually went up into Poland and then crossed to Sweden and found his way then to first to France and then to Switzerland. Tabitha's looking quizzically at me because she remembers when Hitler stole Pink Rabbit. But they were actually crossing in Germany. Many years later, some of you may already know that my uncle received reparations from the West German government. And we've got lots of papers about his application for reparations because he was a civil servant in Czechoslovakia. And one of the things that emerged was that it would be much easier, the process would be much easier, if he had German nationality, or at least dual nationality, British and German. So he applied for German nationality, and they said to him, well, of course, on March the 15th, Hitler declared that all German-speaking people in the Czech lands would be given full German citizenship. So the question was, where were you on that day? And the answer was, we were in Germany. So he did actually become a dual German and British national. His nationality certificate for when he took on British nationality lists him both as Hans Georg Schenk and as Jan Georg Arthur Victor Schenk, just so that there would be no messing about and no misunderstanding.
Why would you want to be in Germany?
Well, his particular reason at that time, which was I think in the 60s, he took dual nationality of West Germany, was that it made it easier for the payment of the reparations which he was receiving. So it was a purely practical thing, really.
Did he ever go back to Prague?
He never did, and that was because it was taken over by the communists, and by the time that all that changed, he had died. He died in 1979. I think it was to his regret that he never had the opportunity to go back to Prague. During the war, Willy, stationed in Germany as a soldier, did make earnest efforts to try to get to Prague to see his mother after the death of his father. But for one reason and another, he wasn't able to. I think, not surprisingly, I mean, it must have been pretty chaotic at that time. So he didn't manage to get back to Prague, and nor did Hans, although, you know, in other circumstances he would have. But he was also told by the British government that they would protect his rights in any country in the world except for Czechoslovakia, because that was his original citizenship. Bill.
Many people here will echo this, but he was my moral tutor, and Hans. And from him, I learned all kinds of wonderful lessons about humility, about gross disorganization, and courtesy, and what this place meant to him.
Yes.
And there was no one prouder of having a fellowship than Hans.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, Roger, on his immediate right there, had invented a totally fictitious life for him out in Appleton, where he ran a recording studio and had a rock band, and it was called Puppet Duck, and his band was called the Crackers. Roger could both mimic him and Ise. And there was
and the Simmons as well. He was very good memory.
Absolutely. And there was this piece he did where Ise was beating Hans up for not allowing him to go to Ascot's and buy the record, his latest record. And if you heard it, it was marvelous. Anyway, I mean, many of you have had different experiences of Hans, because he could be a rascal and all that kind of stuff. And Hazel's kitchen was always immaculate. But to me, he taught me a lot.
And those of you who know Roger Hauser know he is a very naughty boy.
Yes.
David, I think you had a question.
Thanks for that, Chris. It was most engaging talk and brought back all sorts of memories of Hans. What you said about Hans's academic career was interesting, moving from one side to another, because as I remember, he was actually appointed as a university lecturer in economic history, and desperately tried to change it to a lectureship in the history of ideas, or whatever it may be. I think he was something of an outlier in the history faculty, wasn't he? Because
definitely.
although economic history was regarded as a serious subject, I think the history of ideas was not. And he always suffered from that. I think he was forced, wasn't he, to give lectures on economic history, which he most reluctantly did.
I think that he was very, very difficult to classify. The book that he published, that is the DPhil thesis that he wrote during the war, The Aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars, the copy that I had at home didn't have a dust cover. So I recently looked on Amazon and various other sites and finally found a copy with a dust cover. And it says at the top of it that it's from the Library of Sociology. Now, you would never think that Hans was a sociologist, but I think he was extremely difficult to classify, and that was the problem in Oxford. I mean, he spent decades, literally, hanging on through, I think he calculated at one stage that he had taught for 20 different colleges. I mean, I suspect that he was greatly helped by the fact that Burckhardt was still a possibility for history undergraduates. And there weren't that many people, that many German-speaking historians around, so he had a bit of a steady income in the Michaelmas term. But then otherwise, it was what teaching he could get. His university lectureship obviously had a salary, but he did need to get some further money. And I think he always hankered after the magical word fellow. And when he became a fellow, I think he was not alone in that, actually. I think a lot of the fellows of Iffley College were delighted to have found a home. So it was... Yes.
I think he also thought, intellectually, Isaiah, who wrote the preface to Mind of the European
To the Mind of the European Romantic, yes. Yes. I mean, he had sort of ambivalent views about that, really, but yes. Just one further anecdote. In the 60s, there was an undergraduate magazine called Jude, named after Jude the Obscure, and it was a kind of sort of fairly radical kind of thing. It didn't last for very long. Well, one time when a new issue of it must have been early 70s actually, Jude had come out. Somebody chalked on the side of 60 Banbury Road, Jude here, to alert people to the fact that this new issue is coming out. And Hans came along and saw it and stopped in his tracks and literally trembled because he read it as though it was written in German. Jude here. And he thought it was a vile bit of anti-Semitic propaganda. And, you know, the thought that it was coming back again here in a country which had been his refuge was deeply troubling to him.
Yes.
One question, referring back to the war, is there any truth in the story that I don't know where I heard it, either from Hans himself or from someone else, that during the war he was approached by the SOE with the idea of parachuting him into German-occupied Czechoslovakia as an agent?
I haven't come across any documentary...
Dressed as a nun.
It may be true. The only thing that comes anywhere remotely near that is that there is a letter in the file in the SPSL archive where he volunteers for any work that will help the war effort. And he does say, you know, that he is a fluent speaker of German and so on. But there's nothing in the documents that I have so far examined which indicates that anybody wanted to take him up on this.
Don't you wish it were true? Well, I think we should let Chris go. Please have a look at these books, which have been on display.